Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's Friday here in the upper Midwest in the United States of America. Uh, Once again, we find our good state of Minnesota is in upheaval, and there's mad protests, and the city's boarded up and waiting for the fires to start. The trial of the first cop from a year ago is wrapping up in the city as we speak. And this man kneeled on a guy grasping, dying, handcuffed, begging for his breath. And this cop did not relent. I can't think of anything much less humane than denying someone of his right to breathe. And he pleads for it. It's not like this guy was in a coma, or so messed up that he didn't want to live. This guy was pleading for his life. And how do you... How do you take away a man's life when your job is to serve and protect? And again, this past week, a young black male, 20 years old, was shot and killed just outside of Minneapolis in Brooklyn Center, which has become a very black suburb. And the city's again on edge. I was up there yesterday and had to finish my taxes, and it's a tense state. There's National Guard troops stationed on a lot of the corners, armed and showing that force. Like I said, half the streets again of the business sections are boarded up, awaiting the fires to start burning again. And it's just sad to see a city I lived in for 30 years to be so in flux and to be so at the edge of this precipice. And this has always been a very liberal, left of center state that was very tolerant and very open to minorities and immigrants. And it doesn't make sense that this is happening here and this is such a focal point. Same with Oregon, where it's happening on the West Coast. These are liberal places where I feel like they're under attack by a system trying to destroy moderation, trying to destroy common sense. One of the great American presidents, Dwight E. Eisenhower, was a 5-star general during the Second World War, and he was a very important figure in American military circles. And he became president for 8 years, I believe from 52 to 60, if I recall. And when he left the White House, he gave a speech to the American people. And if you have never seen it or read it, you should. But in his goodbye speech to the American people, he talks about the military-industrial complex being the greatest threat to America in the coming century. He said the power that these people have and the lengths they will go to maintain their contracts, taking money from the taxpayers to pay for these weapons, is going to be such a security threat to the American people. And they have to be conscious of it, because they won't stop. They will force and push their way to keeping those budgets in place. And it played out in the Cold War for another 25 years. And not a lot of shots were fired, but a lot of bullets were made. And there was some satellite struggles that happened during the 70s and 80s that were loosely about American-Soviet conflict, but it was never a head-to-head, obviously, battle. And into that void, after the communists folded, there was now this new desperation to find a new enemy. And terrorism filled that void for a few decades. But it's become a real nuisance to try to justify and to prove to the international community what you claim the terrorist acts are. There's not a lot of unanimous consensus among the international politic as to what's really happening in a lot of these terrorist claims. And so it became very difficult to fight wars of terror, and all these wars of terror don't need old-style weaponry. It's a much different type of war that they're fighting. So it leaves these military-industrial complex companies, corporations, with all this tactical weaponry and millions of dollars in investment into designing weapons, looking for a new place to drop these weapons. And having heard his warning, and how dire it sounded from a guy that was in the army for most of his life, a 5-star general. And he's like, it's not the war and the enemy you need to be worried about. It's the people who sell you war. You got to be on red alert because they will do whatever they can to perpetuate the essence of violence, the fear of a threat is what they thrive on. And they will do whatever they can to put money and whatever they have into keeping us believing that building weapons is our first and number one priority as taxpaying citizens in this empire. There's too many rebel resistance forces out there. Too many Luke Skywalkers for us to not be vigilant. We must build more Death Stars. And that military industrial complex, those corporations have continued to build an insane number of guns and weapons. We supply the world their guns. And it's, like I've often said, the Creator will forgive when you kill for need. But when you kill out of greed, I don't think the Creator, no matter what his name is, will ever pardon that. And I feel like the serpent consumes its own tail. That old symbology that all great empires seem to follow that trajectory of the empire vanquishing the empire of its enemies, and the people are protected and love the serpent. But eventually the serpent's appetite grows so big and so vast, and there's no more enemies to vanquish, that the serpent starts to feed on its own people. And in my mind, there's no escalation of the conflict between blacks and blue in this country. There's no escalation of the number of black men being shot in this country. What's changed is how we're being fed that feed. How we're being taught to feel and to choose sides. And the average American is being forced every day when they watch the television. Are you pro-black or are you pro-blue? And they've turned race, a common, easy thread to pull at, into this new conflict that will ensure tension in the streets, a scared public that won't question the police being armed to the teeth, by contractors who want a new war to fight that won't have international oversight, and it'll be a slow bleed, and it will go on for decades. But they will turn our streets into war zones in a very slow, incremental deterioration of this empire. And we're a long ways away from the revolution that will topple that system. And I've been saying this is going to happen for a long time. I've seen it. I'm a student of history, and so history always repeats. We do the same thing over. Greed makes bad choices. Always. Greed always dictates what's best for greed. Not best for humanity, not best for my people, not best for the common good. What's best for me and my interests. And to put race back into the hearts and minds of the American public, and to have half the population fearing the cops and the other half fearing the blacks for retribution. I can't imagine what's in the average black man, young man's mind every time he gets pulled over. Because you can get killed for nothing. And your name will be all over the news for weeks. And then the protests happen. And then the protesters, they become marked as troublemakers. And it feeds a prison system that's also for profit. And once you're marked by the FBI and by the system as an agitator, they know how to follow, keep tabs on you. But it forever changes the way you interact with the nation you live in. You've become a terrorist in the eyes of your own government. And sadly, the government is very reactionary in all of this. It's kind of behind the curve. It doesn't understand that it's allowing this military-industrial complex to function as it is. But so much of the money in this country is funneled through these channels. And Congress, Senate, the president even, is reacting to the headlines and the stories that are being brought to us by those who run the cable and television channels, and those are the same people who make guns and build prisons. It doesn't take a genius to see that I don't think the events are set up. I just think they're fed to us in a way to polarize and to sensationalize and to keep headlines in our eyes and ears and mouths every day, so that around the water cooler, people, that's all they're talking about is the tension in these streets and the possibility of more conflict, more riots, more protests, more extreme left, extreme right. And in that melee, who isn't going to say, yeah, the cops need more armored vehicles, the cops need more protective vests, they need bigger guns, they need more anti-aircraft carriers, they need mortar fire. Like, it's got insane how armed our police forces are becoming, and that's only going to increase. Mark my words. Our police forces are going to see, I would guess, billions if not trillions of dollars of arms dumped into them as this new black versus blue conflict becomes more the center of the American narrative. And the American people, and I live in rural America, an hour, 20 minutes from Minneapolis now. I lived in Minneapolis for 30 years. People are being forced to choose black or blue. And you're not given the choice. It's not, oh, I'm going to pick a side. You're daily reminded you need to pick a side. Are you pro-cop? Are you pro-minority? You can't be both. And so even people who might be neutral feel pigeonholed and obligated to be like, well, I don't know a lot of minorities living here in white rural America, so I guess I'm pro-cop. Or if you're living in the inner city and you're surrounded by minorities and you see the abuse and the violence and the poverty and how someone who's a lifetime hustler trying to survive is often portrayed as just this career criminal, when there's white-collar criminals who make much bigger robberies and spend less time in jail than some guy who has a street hustle. A guy who sticks up a woman with a knife for $50 ain't as much of a criminal as a guy who robs a taxpayer or an investor of millions. It's all how we see it in the news and how it's portrayed to us. And it's really, again, jazz is wrapped up in all of this because race and the conflict of that situation in this country is what's fueled black music all this time. And no matter how great a white jazz player you are, I'll say it again, you can't comment on this stuff. You can't come from your soul with this stuff. You can come with your addiction, your wife problems, your children problems, your parent problems, but you can't really comment on social injustice that's oppressed you for centuries. And that's what black music has always spoken about, and that's why black music is so powerful. There's a healing in that music that wants to overcome that struggle. There's a sexual nature to it that's relying on that healing as one of my only outlets for joy and happiness. And because of that powerful want to celebrate, want to be sexual, and to dance and to overcome my struggle, it attracts those outside of the race like a moth to a flame. It's a compelling art form. They dance in spite of it. They make merry and live and joyfully and interact sexually so openly and freely without guilt and shame. It attracts us in. We can't help but want to hear that swing, that bluesy pulse, and want to be free as we now see these people being in their art form. And that's why jazz has always been associated with sex and vice and the brothels and bordellos. And that's why the white women have always been attracted to that sound, because of that pulsing sexual groove that repeats and has that pulse to it. And it's such a powerful attractor. And we admire the resilience and the absolute fortitude of a people that, in spite of being at the end of the barrel of a gun, picks up a trumpet and says, I shall be free. I'm going to march into Canaan and find me a promised land. It's a powerful thing. I'm going to leave it at that, but it's tough seeing my city look like that. Again, soldiers on the streets, fear in the hearts and mouths of everyone I spoke to yesterday. If you owned a business in the places that burned last year, and you just got your insurance money and just put new windows in, and now, in the middle of this trial, another kid gets shot, There couldn't have been a worse time for a cop to shoot a black kid in Minneapolis. In the history of this city, 200 years, there was never a worse time for a cop to say, I'm going to kill a black kid today. So all precautions should be taken. And the female officer who did it was a 22-year cop. She resigned, I guess, immediately, and I'm sure she feels, I don't know. I've heard she feels bad about it because she resigned. But you don't mistake a gun for a taser, which is what the story on the news is trying to be. And we all know they fake a headline. You know, watch The Wire, and you'll see how cops spin stories. So again, I just was there yesterday, and it was tough. Me and my wife were nearly in tears watching the city be just on glass, waiting for that shoe to drop. And there's already been protests and plenty of arrests happening. And if the Chauvin case, if he gets let off or gets a slap on the wrist, America's going to be in trouble. There's going to be a ripple effect across the nation and all the inner cities that is going to be ugly. But there will be thousands of arrests from it. It will escalate the fear and the violence, and more money will get funneled into these new war chests. I hope to say it's not true. I'd love to be wrong. But I've been seeing this coming for a long time, and boy, the serpent is starting to consume us. We're starting to look mighty tasty to said serpent. I know I got a nice little plump on me. I ain't serpent food, nor do I want to be. Let's move on. We're going to just talk about some records I've discovered recently, or found finally recently. And it's a never-ending well. Jazz is a deep, deep well. And no matter how far down you go that spider web, there's all those new strands, new artists, new labels, new places of discovery. And believe it or not, I've kind of exhausted a lot of the great black jazz labels. So it's actually a lot of the great white jazz labels that I've been buying and collecting and looking for. And fortunately, those records aren't nearly as rare or as expensive. So it's interesting filling in all those white discographies. Boy, there's a lot of great white players out there, you know. Just some fantastic, often really forgotten players that made some incredible records, and I've been really enjoying delving through them. And I've already had a lot of the Pacific and the contemporary and fantasy and Bethlehem and Dawn. A lot of the labels were very white centered, you know, versus like I say a Mercury, Emercy, or Argo, or Blue Note, or Prestige, which were very black labels. So just getting a lot of these white labels, and I've had a lot of those white labels for years, but I've been collecting some of the smaller, in between the cracks white labels, like Jazz West, which has some black music on it, obviously, but Storyville out of Boston, I've been collecting that stuff. Some great stuff on that label. Stuff I didn't know a lot about, some of it. Again, Burt Goldblatt brought me to that label in a way. And a lot of it's West Coast stuff. And I'm just finding myself really enjoying a lot of the West Coast jazz. And it's kind of shocking to me how little of it's actually cool. The Brubeck's cool, the Chico Hamilton's cool, the Birth of the Cool was cool. A lot of this West Coast stuff is actually very fiery, very up-tempo. And yet it's a light, brisk up-tempo. It doesn't have that same desperation and sorrow and blues to it. Yet it still is propulsed and just flows over the groove. And these guys are very skilled players. And so I've really been enjoying listening to them. And it does feel like it's being emoted from a different place, you know. I don't get fooled by it very often where I'm like, oh, this feels... And there's even times where there's a black artist on the record and I'll be listening to, like, oh, that sax is really good. Who's that? And I'll look, oh, that's a black guy. You know, and so... And again, it's not always universal. There's white guys that play with a ton of soul and passion. But their history is just different. Both their personal history and their collective history is different. But let's move on. This Oscar Pettiford record we're listening to right now is a fantastic record with a fantastic cover as well. It came out on the debut label, a small little label started by Charlie Mingus. And he was recording pretty experimental stuff for the time in the early 50s. Most of it was on 10-inch initially. And of course, debut was eventually bought up by Fantasy. And Fantasy, of course, launched OJC, which of course this is an OJC reissue of. OJCs sound fantastic. What's so cool about this session, which is I believe is from '52, is Oscar Pettiford is one of the great bass players of all time, but he was also one of the great innovators on the cello. And he plays and plucks the cello and he bows the cello. And then you say, well, what about the bass then? Well, he recruits one Charlie Mingus to play the bass. So you have the great Charlie Mingus playing bass, and you have the great Oscar Pettiford playing cello. And I can't think of another record like that in the jazz canon that has that kind of a setup. It's Oscar Pettiford's sextet. And then the band is rounded out by some fantastic players. Julius Watkins is on the French horn, which is going to give you an interesting timbre and like a sound that's not very often heard in jazz. Phil Urso is on the tenor, who makes a couple records at Savoy and Regent. He's a great player. We don't know much about Phil Urso. He's a white cat who plays a very beautiful blues tone saxophone. And then we have Walter Bishop and Percy Bryce on the drums. It's just a fantastic session that caught me by surprise. Somehow I kind of not realized I didn't have this for a long time. I thought I had most of Oscar Pettiford's discography, and then I was looking at my debut stuff the other day. I'm like, where's that Pettiford record? I'm like, oh, I never did grab that. And I found a copy pretty affordably, honestly, and it's a fantastic session that I highly recommend to people. You should definitely try to dig that one out. Now, if you recall, I made an episode last month about my most sought-after records. Well, I've now found one of the Yusef Lateef records, and I now have found the Bethlehem record. This is Yazoo River Jazz Band featuring Danny Barker, Bethlehem number 6047. It's the last Bethlehem LP I don't have, aside from some compilations, that I'm not even really worried about collecting. The band is actually pretty interesting on this. Sam Parkins on the clarinet, John Letman on the trumpet, who's a great player, who also has a record on Bethlehem. Dick Rath on the trombone, Danny Barker on guitar, Richard Wellstead on piano. Ahmad Abdul Malik is playing the bass on this, which was a very interesting. I was like, wow, it kind of caught me off guard, because Abdul Malik is often more in a bit of an avant-garde setting, and this is kind of a Dixieland, Yazoo Rivers down in Mississippi. And then Manzi Johnson's on the drums. I don't love the cover, if I'm honest, but it's an original pressing. I was alerted to it by someone through my channel who messaged me on I believe on Facebook, maybe it was on email, and told me it was available in Australia from this guy's store. And it wasn't somebody I'd ever bought from before. And the guy only wanted $5 for this record I've been looking for 2 years. Unfortunately, the shipping from Australia on airmail cost me about 4 times what I paid for the record, but I'm thrilled I've got it. A beautiful old Bethlehem, like I said, and that pretty much rounds up my Bethlehem discography. I have all the 10 inches, all the BCP, and now pretty much all the 6000 series, minus a few collections and compilations that I'm not really after. So I have all the original material by Bethlehem now, which is a nice label to have completed. It's a tough label to complete. There's a lot of rare Bethlehem titles out there, so I'm pretty proud of that. So yay, Bethlehem's done. One of the labels I've been diving into is the Jazz West label. And there's some really great stuff on that. I have a couple of Jack Sheldon records coming from Japan. For all I know, they're stuck in the Red Sea in that shipping channel that's been clogged up by our little ship that went into the bank of the Suez Canal. Hopefully they'll be here soon. I'm looking forward to those getting here. I also have an Art Pepper on Jazz West coming in that same box from Japan. But Paul Chambers, of course, made that great record on this label when he was out west with Kenny Drew. Kenny Drew makes this record here, Talking and Walking, with the Kenny Drew Quartet. This record had eluded me for the longest time. Originals are very tough to come by. It's a really rare piece from a small West Coast label that didn't make a lot of copies of their records. I believe the Score label has republished some of them, and then of course the Japanese have redone a lot of them, if not all the label. They have done. There's only, I think, 10 albums on Jazz West. One of the things about this record that's fantastic, aside from Kenny Drew, who's outstanding, is Joe Maini. Joe Maini is fantastic. He plays this light, fluttering alto that just darts about like a cage full of hummingbirds. Just a cage full of hummingbirds. He just floats and bounces and has this light, fun, aerosol kind of sound that's full of a lot of passion. You know what I mean? It's filled with a lot of dexterity and just jumping through the fiery hoops. And I was really impressed by Joe Maini. He was a fantastic player. When I looked him up, I realized I had more of his side work. And he doesn't do a lot as a leader. He might not even have anything as a leader, if I recall. But not a name I know very much about, Joe Maini. And on this record, boy, he's an outstanding figure. And that makes this record alone worthy of tracking down. But it's also with Leroy Vinegar on the bass. And I think Lawrence Marble's on the drums. And Lawrence Marble's a fantastic player as well. And Kenny Drew is one of the real unheralded players of this era. He spends years in Denmark and Europe, which kind of brings him out of the limelight in the American public. But Kenny Drew is not to be ignored. I need to find some of his steeplechase European titles eventually. But I'm still wrapping up a lot of these American labels before I dive into the European ones. On the same label, Jazz West. This one was J4. I think that Paul Chambers is J5. The Sheldons are 1, 2, and 4, I think. And the first two Sheldons are 10 inches. Then they get reissued as a 12-inch. I think there's only two 10 inches and they go to the 12-inch. And there's only 10 titles between both. And one of them is a recoupling of the two 10 inches. But this is a J8, Jazz West 8, Lawrence Marble. And Lawrence Marble's a great drummer who's on a lot of great West Coast sessions. A really unheard of name in a lot of circles. Yet you do see this record posted in some of the jazz books. So I've always kind of been after this one. I finally found this for a decent price as well. And it's featuring James Clay. And if you see my saxophone series or even my episode on Riverside, where to start with Riverside, James Clay's a fantastic Texas tenorman, a big bluesy sound with that thick Texas reed that they use. They use an overside reed in Texas that created this bigger, fuller tone. Basically, if you play alto, you use a tenor reed. If you play tenor, you use a baritone reed. And so they have these really thick sounds that are just wonderful. Clay is a fairly aggressive, bluesy Texas tenorman. And this is an outstanding session as well. And it's got Jamie Bond on the bass and Sonny Clark on the piano. And as you all know if you've watched this channel, I find Sonny Clark to be one of the most important unheralded figures in jazz. A record took me a long time to find was this jazz harpist record by Dorothy Ashby. This is on the Regent label, and Regent was a label that Savoy consolidated back in the late 40s, if I recall. And Regent has its own history going back into the 30s from the same Newark, New Jersey area, satellite in New York. He finally brought Regent into the Savoy fold, and they kind of kept their own artists and direction for the first 5-7 years as they were co-labels. But eventually by 56, 57, Savoy starts putting a lot of interesting new material on Regent. And if you think Savoy records are hard to find, Regent titles are even tougher to come by. They're just not out there. They have the cool green label if they're mono. If they're stereo, they have a red label, like the same thing. And again, it's Savoy production, Ozzy Cadena, Rudy Van Gelder. The entire Savoy team is a part of this. A lot of the band members are going to be Savoy house musicians. Wendell Marshall plays the bass on this. Eddie Jones is on the bass on a couple tracks. Ed Thigpen's on the drums. And then the great Frank West plays flute on this, who makes some great records at Savoy. Of course, of Count Basie fame. So you got to love rare, hard to find records like this. Dorothy Ashby is a great harpist, one of the few jazz harpists out there. Her records on Prestige are fairly well known. She has one on Atlantic, a couple on Argo, one on Jazzland, the Riverside sister label. But this record was always elusive to me. It's her first. I believe it's from 1957, if I recall. Finally found it. Was pretty thrilled about it. If I'm honest, I haven't even listened to it yet. I've been building a porch this week out back with my neighbor, so I haven't had a lot of time to listen, which is always a tough thing. A record I got from actually a former store in Minneapolis. Used to be downtown Minneapolis, was Let It Be Records, named after, of course, the great Beatles song. And he went out of business 15 years ago because the property got bought to build a skyscraper, which never got built. Which at the time when I'm a big skyscraper fan. I think they're the pyramids of our culture. And at the time, I was like, well, I'm losing a great record store. And it was a great record store. A lot of cool imports. It wasn't just like your typical Tower Records. These guys specialize in hard-to-find imported CDs, industrial, house music, nice jazz section with a lot of cool imported titles from Japan. So Let It Be was a fun place to shop. It was downtown, so it was a little more expensive probably, but it was still a place I frequented a lot. But he maintained an online presence, and once in a while I'll be looking for something. I'm like, oh, it's from Let It Be Records. Cool. And so it's always nice to still support the local store, even though he's no longer obviously online. I was looking for something else, which I found there, and I'll show you that later. But this was also in the store, and it gave me a great price on it. It's a Blue Note 10-inch, featuring the new sounds from the old world. One side is Swedish players, one side is UK players. It's great stuff, and he said it was beat up, and yet it played without a skip or a hic. It played really well. I saw a surprise, honestly, because when he described it to me, I thought I was getting it just for the cover, really, but it ended up being more than playable. And we got Kenny Baker, Gordon Longhorn, Harry Mackenzie, Ronnie Scott, who everybody should know. Vic Feldman's on this, Ralph Sharon's on this, Jack Parnell, so Ronnie Chamberlain. So a lot of those are pretty household UK jazz players. Jimmy Duker's on a couple tracks as well. Johnny Dankworth, Don Rendell, Eddie Dawson, Tony Kinsey. So you got a lot of the real famous UK jazz players on this Blue Note session, which I'm sure they just licensed. On the Swedish side, you have Rolf Eriksson, Aka Persson, Putte Wickman, Ulf Linde, Lars Gulen's on this, who's a fantastic baritone player. Sten Karlberg, Simon Brem, Jack Noren. So fantastic Swedes as well. Some of those names I'm familiar with, some of them not so much. But the Swedes won the Estrad Poll winner, and the Brits were one of the Melody Maker Poll winners. And then the other little interesting thing about this, when I got it, it says Seymour Records there, if you can see that. It's got the little stamp of Seymour Record Mart, 439 South Wabash Avenue, Chicago, 5 Illinois. And Seymour's Record Mart was the record store that Bob Coaster from Delmark Records bought to start his record store empire. And it became the Jazz Record Mart, and of course located it in the Loop a few times, and they finally had to move up to the northern suburbs because of rent and the escalating prices of downtown Chicago. But if you're ever in Chicago, the Jazz Record Mart, and Bob, who owns Delmark Records, he's an institution, a huge part of the story. He recorded a lot of great jazz guys and blues guys first. Very in tune to the black scene in Chicago. Black talent was brought to him, and he was happy to publish it and put it out there. And I'm sure a lot of his records didn't make a lot of money, but he seems to have a real love for the art, and that was his first and foremost reason for being, as it were. Now, 3 other 10 inches I got recently that I wasn't even really looking for these because I don't care for the covers, yet they were so cool I couldn't turn them down, were these 3 Prestige New Jazz 10 inches. And I was quite shocked when I found these for. This is New Jazz 101. And if you've ever listened to the channel, you know how I talk about Prestige has that sister label New Jazz. Well, that label comes into existence about 58, 59 for that kind of modern new sound in jazz. But they did use that name early on as well, late 40s, early 50s, when the dawning of the 10-inch come out. So this is New Jazz, number 101, and one side has Lee Konitz with Warren Marsh, Sal Mosca, Denzel Bass, and Arnold Fishkin. On side 2, you have Lenny Tristano, one of the great modern innovators of jazz piano, along with Billy Bauer on the guitar, who's fantastic. Lee Konitz, Arnold Fishkin, and Shelly Manne on the drums. Fantastic early original pressings. And from what I can see on Discogs, these were never reissued. Then number 102, the very next one, Stan Getz, Volume 1. Here he's playing with Alan Eager, Brew Moore, Al Cohn, Zoot Sims, Walter Bishop, Gene Ramey, and Charlie Perry. Al Haig is on a couple tracks. Stan Levy's on a couple tracks. Percy Heath, Tony Ailes. Just all-star talent. New Jazz number 101 and 102. I can't believe I own these 2 10-inches. And again, I got them for a really great price. Super thick plaques. Heavy grain. The vinyl shiny and clean. Why those aren't more collectible and why the seller didn't want more for them, I'm not really sure. Especially the Stan Getz. You can get pretty good money for Stan Getz. But I didn't complain. I felt obligated to buy them when I saw them. And then this is on the Prestige label itself, P114. And this is the great Roy Eldridge, who is one of the most fiery innovators of the trumpet. And there's a bridge between Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie, and that bridge is Roy Eldridge. He was a fantastic, flamboyant, fiery player. Hard to contain. Like, Eldridge had a lot to say, and he had some aggression in his playing. And I think some people were hesitant to play with him almost because he was so fiery, and he seems agitated. And I got the feeling that people even met him. He was a tense guy. He would roll over people, I think, in the studio just because he played with such ferocity. But I'm a big fan of Roy Eldridge. I think he's fantastic. I love his intensity. I love his I ain't gonna be fucked with kind of mode, how he plays from. It just feels so filled with resistance. And it doesn't list the band, it just has a blank back on it. And again, I found this and I was like, I can't not buy that. And Prestige is one of the labels I haven't collected a lot of 10 inches from, in part because almost all Prestige 10 inches did get issued in the 7000 series, including the Stan Getz and the Lee Konitz. I don't know if the Tristano was ever reissued on LP, and I don't think Roy Eldridge has any LPs on Prestige. So I was kind of shocked to find a Roy Eldridge 10 inch on Prestige. But again, I haven't even listened to it yet. I just had another time building this deck out back for the wife and the kids. So that's some of the cool stuff I found. I'm just going to flash through a couple of things I found real quickly. These are Verve titles, and Verve is the one label that's one of the main jazz labels where there's still quite a bit of stuff I don't have. And I have 500 Verve records. But again, there's over 800 of them. I have most of the later Creed Taylor era stuff, and it's the earlier Norman Granz stuff that I've been filling in. And it's so different from the later stuff. This is much more jazz, where the later stuff's much more lounge jazz. It's very black. It's very older wisdom coming from these cats. And I'm going to get into that more because I'm going to do an episode on Verve really soon talking about how to build a Verve library. So I'm just going to show you these titles. Flip Phillips is a great sax player. Another cool little 10 inch by him. I can't remember who's on this. It's a cool David Stone Martin album cover, who of course does a lot of work for Verve, featuring Ray Brown, Hank Jones, and Buddy Rich. You don't get much better than that, guys. That's a rhythm section. Then this is Louis Bellson. This is on Norgran, if I recall. Yep, Norgran number 7. A Louis Bellson 10 inch. Louis Bellson played with Basie. He played with Ellington. He makes some great records on his own. He's a very fiery drummer, very bombastic, if you want to use that word. He's you're gonna notice Louis Bellson on any record that he's on, because he's gonna be doing a lot of fills. If I had to give a rock comparison, he's a bit like Keith Moon, busy and filled with exuberance, and Buddy Rich too, just like a dynamic, fiery player. Bill Harris. This is not the guitar player, Bill Harris. This is the trumpet player, Bill Harris. Hold on. I had a brain fart there. He's a trombone player, if I recall. Bill Harris here with Chubby Jackson, who's a great bass player. Chubby Jackson has some cool titles of his own. Some of them are on Argo. A couple of really good records over there that are really bluesy swing records. Bill Harris is a fantastic player. If I recall, he played with Goodman. I know he plays one of the big swig bands. I think it was Goodman. Maybe it was Artie Shaw. I can't recall. But Bill Harris is a great player. This is also on Norgran. A pretty tough record to come by. I think Ralph Burns does some of the orchestra conducting on this. So it's a nice little mixed piece of disparate sounds. This is Jazz Recital, another Ralph Burns, Billie Holiday compilation. Fantastic Billie Holiday. You gotta love anything with Billie on it. She just bleeds from the soul. Another Clef early title of Count Basie's Dance Party. I think it's a volume 2. There's a volume 1 of this that's blue, but it's the same picture. Again, it's David Stone Martin. I like David Stone Martin's covers a lot, but I actually like Goldblatt's and Reed Miles better. Tal Farlow, if you remember from my guitar series, his records have gotten really expensive and tough to find. I did find this early one, 8021, which I think is a reissue of a Clef release. A Count Basie record, I've always thought I had it, so I've always passed it up. Then I realized I didn't have it. It looks kind of like April in Paris and Basie in Paris, Basie in London. It's from that same era. And I always thought I had the one with the scooter on it, but I guess I didn't. This is Basie Rides Again. And I think this has also been reissued from Clef material. And Clef and Norgran were early Norman Granz labels that ended up becoming compiled and reissued on the Verve label, which was his next venture. And you gotta love what Norman Granz does for the industry. More West Coast jazz, Stan Getz, 8177. It's a pretty tough record to find. Doesn't list the musicians on an easy way for me to find. Jerry Mulligan meets Johnny Hodges, another early record I didn't have by these two. Both of them have fairly large discographies, especially Jerry Mulligan. And then this Ella Fitzgerald record is her playing the blues with Wild Bill Davis on the organ. And it's a real gutsy live performance that will show you the raw fury that is Ella Fitzgerald. She's not to be messed with. No matter what context you hear Ella Fitzgerald in, she's the boss, you know. And I feel bad for the white racist dude that tried to say something to Ella Fitzgerald, because she's gonna beat you with a nightstick. She's gonna let you know, ain't no one talk to my boys, my people, or me in that tone. She was a real ambassador, and she should be considered an American hero. As much as the lady who stitched the flag, as much as the guy who wrote Star Spangled Banner, Ella Fitzgerald's a real American. That's what freedom looks like. She's a bad, bad girl. Big fan of Ella. She gets kind of mislabeled, I think, as easy listening pop jazz, and she's not. She's done the American Songbook, and a lot of her association to white people were those records that sold well in the white homes. Her doing all those great American Songbook artists, you know, the Rodgers and Harts and the Gershwins. But when she plays the blues, when she swings, when she scats, when she bebops, she's